Recording. Oh, friends, what a immense pleasure it is on this chilly Friday morning to have Brando Skyhorse on the Podstack. Brando is a friend of mine whom, like our last guest, actually, this is kind of a funny coincidence. I got to know through like campus visit-y things. But then, we ended up really vibing, and he has become a really very, very awesome writer friend with whom I speak about creative nonfiction and fiction. Today, we're going to be talking about this book of Brando's. But before we get into that, and before, Brando, we have the pleasure of hearing you read from it, I just want our viewership, because it's ours now. We're sharing the viewership today. I want our humble viewership to know that Mr. Brando Skyhorse is a well-decorated novelist and memoirist. He has first book, which is over on those shelves over there. So I'm not going to go
It's on
grab it.
my shelf too. I
It's
should have, yeah, I should
you
have
want to
held
go
one
get
up,
it?
but
Go get it while I say
let's
this.
see if I can.
The book Brando is getting is called The Madonnas of Echo Park, and in 2011, it won the Penn Hemingway Award, which no one should sneeze at
Look at
ever.
that. That like that
And I
gold
see it
sticker.
right
Wow,
there.
fancy, right? Fancy.
Yes, Hemingway's own pen. And he also won the Sue Kaufman First Fiction Award, which is amazing. It's a fantastic book, polyvocal, really immersed in a sense of place, which we will get into. And he's also written, in addition to this, a fantastic speculative novel called My Name is Iris, which is behind me right there. It's behind Brando too. He's gonna go get it. Good. The eponymous Scoot. There it is.
There we
Name is
go.
Iris. Another wonderful book by our
Wow, look
very
at that jacket art too. Isn't that fancy? I know. It's great,
fancy
right?
jacket on. Um, I gifted the hardcover of it, but I have the paperbacky side. So anyway, I don't have a jacket, an Iris jacket. What was I going to say? Oh, anyway, Brando is a professor in the MFA program, director of the MFA program at IU Bloomington, which is in Indiana. And he is just a lovely fellow. Brando, thank you so much for coming on the Podstack today. Um, I was so deeply stoked to read this book because this is a book about it's about mistaken identity in a lot of senses. And of course, we're going to talk about that, right? But this is the kind of thing that is stranger than fiction, which, when something's stranger than fiction, it must be memoir, right? So,
Oh,
we
I
will,
like that. I like that. Just yeah, I like that description. That's cool. I like that. Yeah.
I'm glad because your book like really falls in that category. So let's chat about this. Well, of course, let's actually have you read from it. So we've got a selection picked out. In
Okay.
fact, my favorite few pages in the book.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Yeah. Um,
Uh, yeah. Should I just dive in or
Go ahead and dive in.
yeah.
We'll give you a little bit of context in this moment. Brandon,
Okay.
this is towards the end of the book. And so I'm actually flipping to it right here. This is you, well, I'll let you talk a little bit about this. Give us a bit of context before you dive in and then go ahead and read.
Yeah. So to basically, summarize, as you said, a stranger than fiction story. My birth name is Brando Kelly Ulloa, Ulloa, and both of my biological parents were Mexican American. My Mexican American father left or abandoned me or was chased away, depending upon who's telling the story. And my mother decided to essentially reinvent both of us as American Indians. And I didn't know this until I was about 12 or 13 years old. And when I discovered this, I guess, deception, I was encouraged by her to keep up the lie because, among other things, my mother suffered from what I would now categorize as borderline personality disorder. I didn't know it then. She was emotionally abusive, physically abusive, etc. And in the course of this life that I had, I had five stepfathers, four of whom, shall we say, had rather unique entanglements with law enforcement. And yeah, it's quite a story. And to me, it's the nature of putting this together for me was more almost kind of like I want to say detective work, which I think like a lot of memoirists talk about because I did like some research and Unfortunately, most of the principal people have passed away. But the reason that I wrote this book was I wanted to see if I could answer a very simple question. Why? Why did this happen to us? Why was my mother eccentric? Was she mad? Were we just born under a bad sign? And so part of any good memoir, I think, is a memoirist essentially communicating to a reader what has changed in their life, what have they been transformed to. When I teach my grad students memoir, which I'm doing this semester, the thing that I emphasize to them is that memoir is about change and transformation, and that's what this book is about. So hopefully it's a hopeful journey. I think it's hilarious in parts, but I've been told that when people hear the audiobook, it sounds kind of sad, which was certainly not my intention. But the part that you've asked me to read is essentially kind of like we're near the end of the book and the speaker. And I want to make this clear also. When I say the speaker, it's like this is the speaker in the book, which of course I wrote it, but I always encourage my students to designate there's a difference between the speaker in the book versus you, right?
Mm.
Because there's a distillation that occurs. There's essentially like a version of you that exists on these pages, which I think is important, especially to young people who are writing their own memoirs, so that when they look on the pages, they don't perhaps look on their actions or the actions of others, with hostility or hatred or disappointment. Two versions, right? So
Yeah.
this version right here is essentially the speaker taking stock of the journey that he's been on, and it happens just before the section that's called closure, and so I think it's an appropriate place for me to dive in and share with you. So I've made the choice not to wear my glasses. I hope that's not going to come back to haunt me in about 10 seconds. I guess we'll find out. So let's see where I should start. I lied for years about who I was and made up stories in college about a thuggish life in an inner city jungle that was never really that rough. My own brief sojourn into storytelling, inventing a life as a Sunset Strip club kid, seeing someone shot in the head at point blank range, always rang out like the bullshit that it was. Succumbing to my mother's myth making made me realize that every storyteller needs more than good stories. He needs to understand why he's telling the story he tells. Narrative is breath. My mother lied in her stories for the same reason I've told the truth in this one. From the breath my grandmother gave me to the breath it takes for you to read this sentence, stories sustain us. They carry us through the lives we convince ourselves we can't escape to get to the lives we ought or need to live instead. They create out of endless chaos a beginning, a middle, and an end. It took the writing of this book, which I've been thinking about for almost 20 years, to understand what made my mother tell such incredible tales. Stories can help you survive. They can help transform your life. They can transform you from where you are into wherever you want to be. My mother turned her cage of a bedroom into a castle. Her prison became a launch pad for escape into a whole new identity. Perhaps that's why my mother was such a fan of killing herself off in her stories. She'd reveal that her brain tumor, which she never had taken one last final turn for the worst, and with time so short, revel in the temporary attention I gave her over and over again. Wherever I hear that someone is dying of an incurable disease, has tricked an always disbelieving public through a fake Facebook profile, I sigh and think, Mom, but I understand. Strangely, so do others. I talk about my mother often when I give class talks about my first novel, The Madonnas of Echo Park, which is set in the largely Mexican American neighborhood, pending gentrification, of course, of Echo Park. How is it that someone with the most American Indian of names came to write a story set amongst Mexicans? It's impossible to talk about that book without telling my and my mother's stories. In Idaho, I met an American Indian college student named Effie Hernandez. I'd never told my story to an Indian before. Here at last, I thought, was my reckoning. I'd have to pay for all the attention and special treatment my name had given me throughout the years. It was my turn to stay silent and absorb someone's rightful anger for appropriating a name, a culture, a people. After a thorough grilling during the class, Effie approached me afterward. I was prepared to not like you, she said, but I understand now why you lived the life you did. Of all the things your mother could have wanted to be, she wanted to be an American Indian. That's pretty amazing.
Mm.
The great American Indian writer Sherman Alexie once joked, Indians have to be so careful around non Indians, we just make stuff up. I'm almost as good a storyteller as my mother is, but I'm a terrible liar. My mother wasn't an Indian, but by Sherman's metric, she was the perfect Indian storyteller.
Mm.
I'm not an Indian either, but feel I'm still somewhere between two names and two cultures. It's difficult because I can't even occupy the gray space mixed children try to claim for themselves. I get emails from Stanford's American Indian Alum Network that say, Dear Native Alum, while I struggle to learn Spanish beyond a second grade level. In New York, where I lived at the time of this writing, I'm less Mexican or American Indian and more some kind of ethnic superhero, passing man, capable of passing for whatever any member of another ethnicity wants me to be. In their Indian or Pakistani or Latino eyes, they scan me over and ask, Are you like me? Yes, I nod, but who is that? Who am I? I've been mistaken for Turkish, Pakistani, Indian American, Sri Lankan, Persian, Afghani, Egyptian, and a dozen other ethnicities. Each man, for it is usually a man who mistakes me as one of his own, says, Oh, you'd be right at home in my country. The feeling of another man claiming me as a member of his own people and his own homeland is irresistible to someone who feels he truly has neither. I'm also between two fathers, the father who left me and Frank, the father who stayed. He tried to raise me in between all of the men that my mother married. I'm no longer a boy who needs to wait under a gauzy streetlight or a curb outside a bar or hide in the backseat of a car for a father to take me home. Two fathers are already there waiting for me. One has something I want, the other has something I need. I can't decide which father is which. When I dream of my own children, there's a fiery, rosy cheeked daughter named Nova, or a son who's still nameless because it took so long for me to find my own name. In my dreams, I sing to my children in a golden lullaby. I am your father. I will teach you every day what every father I was lucky enough to have taught me. I will put your needs first above my fear, anxiety, and depression, and you will help me appreciate chaos more than I did when I was a child. I will strive to be perfect and fall far short. I will fail you. I will embarrass you. I will be frustrated with you for petty reasons that will later make me ashamed. I will expose you to, I hope, limited levels of familial insanity. I will be there for you every day of my whole life. I hear my mother saying, like at the end of a movie, when the credits begin to roll, Do you think Brando makes it? Of all the things the men I call my fathers taught me, the lesson that matters most is spoken together in six different voices. Sometimes it is enough to survive. And when I am a father at last, I want to gather the men who fathered me over a large family style dinner that is a physical impossibility except in my dreams. After a few drinks, our memories would recede like the tide, and the day to day lives we lead would spill out in all their banal glory, and we'd laugh at how ordinary our days have become. And aren't we grateful for that type of steadiness in our lives now? A chorus of six men calling me son might sound ludicrous to you, but to me, it's the sound of survival. Voices that have the power by the very noise they make to turn madness into song.
Mm. Oh, thank
Oh, thank
you.
you. Thank
Wow,
you. Oh, I'm a
gorgeous.
little rusty. It's been a while. So
Well, yeah, happy to help get some of the rust off the wheels of this one because this
I
is just
appreciate that.
it's
I appreciate
such
that.
a pleasure to read, Brando. And I'm so excited to be talking about it. as you were reading, in fact, during your preamble, even I like questions came up for me, or rather extensions of questions that I think I might have already articulated to you. So I will do my very best to not be like over verbose, I think, or like ask you too many questions. I think though, if I'm kind of collating in my head, the place I really want to start is the with this sort of like storytelling and reinvention, right? And
Mm,
so I think, um, reading this book as a novel, right, which we will get into the
yeah,
memoir, the
sure,
genre
sure.
distinctions, yeah, right. But like if I'm just Joe Schmo off the street, I don't know who Brando Skyhorse is, right? And I pick this up and who knows, like it could be a memoir, it could be a novel. Of course I'm captivated by Maria Ulloa. Like of course I am. And I think it's so, she's it's so interesting that both your mother and your grandmother were really into these like Betty Davis, Joan
Mm,
Crawford, old
hmm.
Hollywood, larger than life,
Very much so. Very much so.
hyper, hyper volatile, terrifying kind of, and incredibly talented, but also like incredibly, kind of abusive personalities. Which, by the way, the fact that she even liked Faye Dunaway as Joan Crawford.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's quite interesting. We grew up in Southern California, and
Yeah.
my grandmother was raised by her mother, who was
Yeah.
also emotionally volatile, abusive. There's a little bit about her in the memoir as well. And she lived in my grandmother was born in Los Angeles in 1920. And one of the first memories that she told me was of her mother, who was obsessed with Hollywood, obsessed with, the sort of
Sure.
the silent era, golden era of like Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
Not the golden era, but like the silent film era of Hollywood. So she took my grandmother when she was 9 to the premiere of City Lights,
Yeah.
which is a Charlie Chaplin film. And I've seen that film dozens of times. Again, I guess looking for some sort of connection or whatever. And they were at the premiere. This is when they had movie premieres in downtown LA. And
Wow.
there were thousands of people there. That's the way my grandmother remembers it. But again, looking at like, newspapers, like, yeah, that literally would have thousands of people would show up. Crowd control, not a thing in the 1920s, not really a
Oh,
thing. And so they went there, and apparently my grandmother, at the age of 9, was almost crushed to death, and the story that she would tell with these like this rapturous look in her eyes, because she was totally like just in love with her mother. Just that was her idol, her everything. The
yeah.
first thing that my great grandmother said to her was like, um, we almost died because of you. I didn't even get to see Charlie Chaplin. What's the matter with you? And so there's this
Yeah.
sort of like this like kind of staggered like thing. It's this almost like, I don't want to say like infection, but like this obsession, or this being drawn to the idea of being famous, of being something more than you could be, than just like, a young Mexican woman from like, Echo Park or East Los Angeles. So in each generation, my great grandmother and my grandmother, who's also fascinated with old Hollywood, one of the stories I mentioned in the book was that one of my grandmother's prized possession was a fan note that she got on personalized stationery from Betty Davis. And what was the fan note about? The fan note was that my grandmother wrote her a letter of support when Betty Davis's daughter wrote a memoir. It was a tell-all memoir. Most people remember Mommy Dearest. They don't remember that it like spawned a slew of additional tell-all memoirs. Like I forget what her name was, but Betty Davis's daughter wrote a tell-all memoir, and my grandma's like, "That's just horrible." Wrote Betty Davis a letter of support, got a personalized fan letter back. Amazing, right? Not like, "Oh, I loved you in like whatever movies you've been in," but
Right.
just like, this person was ungrateful. So again, from great grandmother to grandmother to mother, who, my mother had her own sort of like, I
Yeah.
guess, obsession or relationship. But depending on like what stories my mom told you, she ran into Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. I mean, like literally, like a who's who of people from like the 60s and 70s, Charlene Tilton, like, it's
Well,
like,
you know,
yeah.
and then Brando,
So
I think of you reading Betty Davis's daughter's memoir and completing the Ms. in a Beam
yeah, yeah, no, that's that. I should have done that. I should have. I again, I don't even know where that letter was, but like, it was
incredible.
to me, it's this idea, right? So I think the idea of me writing a memoir, writing about this family who, again, I think in many way valued loyalty, valued secrets.
Mm.
My mom always said that I was telling too many
Oh no, I think we've frozen Brando.
People, our business. She said I needed to be more like the mafia,
Yeah,
without igniting. I'm back. I'm back.
you're back.
Sorry, right?
Yep.
So
No,
the
that's
whole like
okay.
my mom said I should be more like the mafia without acknowledging
Moro
that one of the
Merta.
key components of the mafia, it's not just secrecy, but community and family. So we had the secrecy part down. It's the family
It's
part
the
that I think
family you're still
got lost in
wrestling with.
translation. Yeah,
Well, and
that's
so
the
this is
part.
actually, it's funny because this book, right, is like it's not just a it's not it's such an American story, right? In that, of course, that it's like, it's an immigrant story. Of course,
Mm,
it's like a wanting to be special or wanting to be famous story. But I think what I see this book as is as a, an America story, and that it's also a wanting to be someone else story, right? And
yeah,
so I think
sure.
the way that I was so like captivated by your mom, both in the kind of like, oh my God, this is a bit of a more than a bit of a car wreck, right? Like this is can't look away, but also in that like Maria Ulloa is an example of like I came, maybe not necessarily I came to America too, but like I am in America and this is an opportunity to deracinate. This is an opportunity to shed these
Yeah.
roots, not be another boring Latina woman in Echo Park. And so like it was so incredible that the way she would do that, right? Because she's not Andrew Carnegie. She can't like become a young entrepreneur
Yeah.
like white
Hmm.
dude, right? She's going to spin this fiction.
Yeah.
And so I think my first question to you about that, Brando, would be how do you see, like in writing this, right, and in living this, no less, like how do you see the American dream kind of like articulating itself through the desire to spin these fictions or to be someone else, become someone else? Um, and your mom did that, bringing you along with her.
So I appreciate that question. That's a really great question. And I, I, I feel like my thinking on this has evolved over time. Uh, I think that in order for me to have created an effective portrait of my mother, um, I needed the same thing that I feel people need in terms of like their pursuit of the American dream. The reason that we're drawn to those stories is empathy.
Mm,
And I think that just in terms of thinking about this kind of time and place we're in right now, right, without even getting into all of that, right? But I think that it required an enormous amount of empathy for me to look at somebody who had abused me, somebody who was, let's just say not the ideal PTA baking cookies, kind
right,
of mom. It took
right.
some distance to be able to process these events and to basically be able to like look into her perspective, try to step into her shoes and say, okay, what was the goal here? What was the agenda? What was her outcome? And I do think that requires an enormous amount of empathy. And I think that's why we're drawn to the American dream narrative. Because I think each of us, when we see a successful American dream narrative, we're looking at us, right? We're looking at like, oh, that could be us.
Mhm.
We have the ability to be this person who starts from nothing, who can become something. And I think that requires an empathy to understand the choices that those people made, the decisions that they made in order to achieve that outcome. And I think in my mom's mind, she had pretty grandiose idea of like what she was looking for, fame, celebrity, and whatever, which again is a very common dream. People are still chasing it, influencers, etc. There's really not that much of a difference. So I think calculating that and understanding that she was a young woman. She had me not like, she wasn't 18. She was in her 20s when she had me, but that feeling that somebody of her, I guess, abilities, somebody who was attractive, somebody who was young, somebody who was very articulate and could just enrapture people with their stories, why
Yeah.
should she settle for being, to use her language, just another Mexican from East LA, right? Just
Well,
another ignored person. So
exactly right. Another ignored person, and then I think the economic immiseration piece, right? Of like Maria Ulloa is this woman who's born with these enrapturing, brilliant storytelling abilities. And because she's not born into a Boston Brahmin family,
yeah.
in Newton, Massachusetts, and she's not going to go to Harvard, and she's not, like a young white man, right? Like she is going to have a very different experience. And I think that's something that this is one of the questions that came up for me reading your book, Brando, because you talk so much, and you talk beautifully in that excerpt too, right? about passing, code
Yeah.
switching, the
Yeah.
endless kind of like fungibility of identity, right? Where you could show up and you're like, I'm Brando, and people are like, you're Pakistani, like, you're Egyptian.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it too, I think identity plays such a role in making oneself. And so, you had the situation where like the book describes really pretty crushing poverty that was experienced by your family in East LA. And so there is an extent to which, like you describe it, this is such a captivating read, but you describe not only code switching as both like a fake native person,
Yeah.
right? And an
Yeah.
actual Mexican person, but also like code switching as someone who is in these working class environments and then like being at Stanford, right? Or being in these more
Hmm.
rarefied academic, wealthier environments.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so God, I'm like deeply fascinated by how you see like identity playing a role there and kind of maybe what you learned about like through your own kind of journey and discovering your roots or like how that was kind of reflected for you in writing this.
Hmm. So one of the sort of offshoots of creating this memoir was my growing interest in the idea of passing, which again, just
Mm,
to take a very large topic and kind of like simplify it, is where one group attempts to attain something that is reserved for another group by like,
right.
either like visually passing or by dressing or like people being
Yes.
mistaken for a person, you doing nothing at all, like you just, standing there and like, oh, I think you're Pakistani or whatever. In
Mhm.
fact, I've put together an anthology called
I
We Wear
was
the
gonna
Mask.
say
This is
thank
the
you.
other book that wasn't
Good.
mentioned, also right here handy and available wherever finer books are sold. And these are all original essays, I might add. So the offshoot of the memoir, the question that you're asking, right, is the idea of like, how does one look for a grounded sense of identity when you have your parents here on one hand and you feeling or realizing you're actually a part of this other community? And so the idea of passing, I think the concept of passing, I think has really kind of helped me isolate and understand more about like my own relationship to identity. Because one of the first stages of passing is what you would call identifying prospects, which is realizing like, oh, well, if I'm a Mexican, people perceive me this way in California. But if I'm an American Indian in California, I'm perceived this way. And again,
Mm,
that's just geography, right? If my mother had been trying this in Oklahoma, there wouldn't have been this sense of like, oh, you're an American Indian. That's great. It would have been like, we have a whole set of negative stereotypes out here that we would associate you with, right? The
mm,
other thing that I've come to wrestle with in terms of, understanding identity is that when people focus on passing, right, they think of the high profile cases like Rachel Dolezal and something like that.
mhm.
They think about gain. They think about exploitation. They think about people who have like, extracted something for themselves to get something, you know, to get benefits. What they don't often focus on is loss. And that's something that for me has been extraordinarily helpful in terms of negotiating my own identity. There are whole swaths of like my identity that I just lost because my mother made the active choice for many years to raise me as an American Indian, denying me the ability to learn Spanish. Again, I couldn't learn Spanish in the house because like I don't want to hear that language in here, denying me any sort of like understanding of like Mexican American culture because that's not where her focus was on. And again, as I explained before, my mother was abusive and was not a person you wanted to disagree with. It's not like I could just go out and say, well, I'm going to do this now. And it's like, no, you're not. So it took a long time to kind of come to grips with this sense of, this alternate life that I could have had. And it was only until I discovered my biological father, which I write about at the tail end of the memoir. I discovered him after many, many years. I'd had his name, I didn't have anything else, and discovered he had a family. So he had three daughters. So all of a sudden, I now have three sisters. Once I discovered that through line, that's what brought it together. And the other sort of stage of passing, kind of like the end stage of passing, is what we call conciliation or reconciliation. Conciliation is basically where you acknowledge, hey, I was passed or I did some passing myself. And like, I'm just going to be honest with you. And reconciliation is when you do the same thing and then your community says, I got you. I
Mm-hmm.
understand. And, I think that for me, what was so helpful was my sisters, because again, like they didn't know who I was. Two of my sisters literally didn't even know I existed,
Mm-hmm.
even though my photograph was buried in their photo album in their house as a child. And when I finally met them, I was like, there I am. There, yeah, our mutual father put him there. They're like, we just thought that was some cousin from Mexico. We had no idea that was our brother, right? So that providing that reconciliation, providing that acknowledgement, I think for me has made me a lot more comfortable discussing identity and realizing that this is what I'm meant to do, right? I
Yeah.
have an American Indian name. I understand a stereotypical American Indian name at that. I could understand if that's what you would think that I was. I'm actually Mexican American. Here's a 10-second version of my story. So be it.
I feel so God. So when you say that's what I meant to do, right? Is that kind of a nod to I remain Brando Skyhorse and I continue to right, assert the truth, which
Yeah,
is that I am
yeah.
Mexican American man. Yeah. And so you're talking about like being some like that, like you are almost like that is what you feel like you're part of or all of, or what your work is creatively is to express that.
Yeah, I feel to kind of explore that boundary because
Oh,
again, like the way I talk about it in academic terms, if I have
yeah.
to, I'm interested in ethnic identity development and achievement. And what passing is essentially it's like a fracture. It's almost like a hack that happens between development and achievement. It's like you were meant to go this way, but in actuality, you got like put this way instead. And again, sometimes you're passed by other people in that community. Sometimes you do more active passing the way that my mom did. But you know, when people ask me like, well, why don't you just call yourself Uyola, right?
Mhm.
For many reasons, right? Number one, this was the name that my mother gave me. My mother died when she was 50. I was 23, 24. So this is in a certain way a way to keep my mother close to me. As long as I'm acknowledging the backstory behind this name, that feels acceptable to me. That's my decision.
Mhm.
Secondly, my own biological father, Cuddy, though, he calls me Brando Skyhorse. Like, I don't think it would feel weird for him. And that's the thing. It's like, for me to carry the name of somebody who abandoned me, that's one step too many. I can't
Right.
do it. But the fact that my own biological father also doesn't feel comfortable with that, it's like, okay, well, then that resolves itself. Like,
Sure.
we both know who each other is. Like, I know who he is and he knows who I am. And we're comfortable with this life that I've essentially had to make out of basically nothing. And
Yeah.
so I feel as long as I'm straightforward about, the name, where it comes from, my agenda, there are no shortage, honestly. Raphael, there are no shortage of stories. There's no shortage of passing stories. There's no shortage of like, stories about race and ethnicity for me to explore, either on my own as a fiction writer or just kind of out in the world. So I feel like there's plenty to keep me busy.
Oh, yeah, gosh. I mean, I'm in fact, not only is that exciting for me as one of your enthusiastic readers, but it's also something I'm experiencing on like the gender side of things. I was so excited to
Sure,
read,
sure.
yeah, Take This Man, because not only actually is there a character in the novel I'm working on who is, a who is sort of essentially kind of like billing himself as a race that he isn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there's a conversation that two of the main characters are trans, and there's a conversation between the two of them. They're trans masculine, and one is really antagonizing the other. And the antagonist says, in reference, right, to this Sharif character whose name is not really Sharif, just to give you a sense of,
Yeah, sure,
yeah, it
sure.
says, like I mean, this is America, right? Like he came from Lebanon, quote unquote, not really, but he came and he made himself into what he is now. And, just because we were born women, like it doesn't mean we can't be men. Come on, it's the fucking American dream. And
Mm-hmm.
so I
Mm-hmm.
think like, it's such an that that felt like a really exciting thing to write for me because in many ways discourse around transness kind of mirrors discourse around race in that you will have folks coming from or obviously sexuality, right? We have folks coming from a very biodeterministic point of view, which as you and I both know, can get into some really scary
Yeah,
territory.
sure, sure.
And then you also have folks coming from who are like raising questions about identity and desire and self-determination, right? That I think, makes other folks uncomfortable. And the first thing I thought about, I was so excited to read Take This Man, because the first thing that popped into my head was I mean, not a perfect comparison, but you were almost kind of like a version of Jazz Jennings. For what happened for you with passing racially kind of happened for her, without even getting into the debate of can children, consent to
Yeah, yeah.
gender interventions, right? We're not even getting into that, but just as a young child, right, it was kind of um it kind of foreclosed upon that Jazz, who was born male, would be anything but female going forward.
Mm,
And there's been a lot of discussion around that from even from Jazz herself about like, how is this benefited me? How is it not? And it's the way in which parents were involved. I mean, it makes me think of, right? Like there wasn't really like there wasn't a point, there wasn't a Dolezalian moment for you, presumably, right? Like or like for the adult trans person where it's like, oh, hey, I think that XYZ, I want to kind of self-determine in this direction. You were Brando Skyhorse. You had to accept that you were Brando Skyhorse. So it's
hmm
almost that you were
hmm
like retrofitted with this identity. It was created for you. You stepped into a kind of like a novel or a play, which is how I almost feel about jazz. And so I'm wondering, you talk about passing in the passive voice, right? You are passive,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so this will be my last really identity specific question, but can you talk about, for you, the difference between being past and passing, how that's come up in your life, and then I think also like where autonomy and self-determination come into play.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a big that's a big I'll try to
That
keep
could be the
it
whole hour. Yeah.
I'll try to keep it brief here, right? So um it's interesting that like I feel like my mom raised by my grandmother who again was born in 1920 came from a very old school style of parenting, even though my mother came of age in the late 50s, early 60s, 70s, and I think passed herself off as like somebody that was very, very progressive and like, I want my child to do this, I want my child to do that. She was still very much like, you are my property.
Mm.
I heard that multiple times a day. Oh, you are my property. I can do whatever the fuck I want with you. And if I want to harm you, I'm going to harm you. And if I want to kill you, I can kill you. Like again, like that just from like a daily thing, right? So that kind of like indoctrination coupled with, you know, this is who your father is, and this is what your name is. And when people ask you, this is what you're going to tell them. To the point where all of the photos from my biological father were like kept separately. I didn't even see, she kept them obviously, but she kept them like, like locked in her room. But then I was presented with photos that she would write false captions on. So the level of deception here was pretty extreme, to the
Yes.
point when I realized around 12 or 13, oh, like all these things don't really make sense anymore. Even when she told me, this is who your father is, he's actually Mexican, I still didn't believe her. Because again, it's like, that's the story on one day. Look at all these photos with like they're in her
Right.
handwriting. These are all things that she captioned herself.
Mm.
What made it worse was that we were living in the same house with my grandmother, and my grandmother went along with it. My grandmother would basically say whatever your mom says is what it is, in part because they had a very volatile relationship too. So you have these two adult figures who are essentially saying, this is what your identity is, this is what your story is, who are you to challenge that? So to me, being past was a very sort of like passive, no pun intended, like a very passive means of existing, but it was also a means of like survival, because as one of the things I
Right.
talk about in my book, my mother tried to murder me twice. That's not an exaggeration. She tried to kill me twice. Once when I was 5, the other when I was a sophomore in college. And so she wasn't a person that you necessarily wanted to have a dispute with or disrupt, right? Now, the idea of passing, there was that short period. Obviously, my mother was still alive. I knew who I was. there were a couple of attempts where I would make efforts to tell people, oh, I'm actually this, and then be punished for it. And, obviously, like, I mentioned in the book that my high school sweetheart, very dear person, very, very just, special person, my first love, was Vietnamese.
Mhm.
And we had been together for about 6 weeks. So I told her, well, obviously we're going to get married at some point. Like we're going to be together forever. So I should be completely honest, right? And like, this is who I am. And she dumped me. And she dumped me because when she came to America, she had a lot of negative interactions with Mexican Americans. And so to her, it was like, you lied to me, you were deceitful, and I get it. I understand it, right? Um, and then when I went and, mistakenly went to my mom for some sort of comfort, she's like, I told you. This is what they actually think about you. So again, it was this negative feedback loop that's like, this is why I did this is why I did what I did for you. Because if people actually realize who you are, they will hate you, they will reject you, they won't respect you. All the cool things that like, people have said about you has nothing to do with your achievements, has nothing to do with up here. It's just because of the name. So the next time you do that again, that's the same sort of response, right? So for a few years, like I was just in this like this kind of like this negative loop. And then
Mhm.
after she passed away, slowly I started to tell people, and the response I got was like, "Oh, weird, but okay." And so I realized, oh, like it was like a dismantling. And so I realized that the only way in which I could ethically pass, right? I keep the name, but I tell people, hey, you're asking me about my identity. Because there's all like, it's like it's not like I'm going around like forcing this on people.
Sure.
People
Yeah.
ask if people hear my name, within 10 seconds, someone will ask me, what's the deal with that?
Hmm.
And so I could go around with a big chip on my shoulder saying, oh, well, like I'm tired of answering this question. I've answered 80,000 times. Or I could say, hey, glad you asked. Yeah, it's an American Indian name. Because again, as I describe in the book, my mother got this name from corresponding with an American Indian. As far as I know, as far as my research revealed, he was also American Indian. I believe that he was,
Hmm.
but I'm actually Mexican American. And so that's my story, right?
Yeah.
So to me, I think that the idea of saying, hey, I'm aware that there are consequences that come from people who have borrowed identities, stolen ethnicities, and there's a responsibility here that I feel if I'm going to have this name out in the world and you're going to ask me about it, because again, it's not like, oh, I'm volunteering left and right. People hear the name, they invariably ask, I, at the very least, owe them an honest answer. So that's how I kind of make my way through the world, right? Being past, form of survival.
And
Passing or having passed, right? Kind of basically acknowledging this is the life I've had. It's not the life that I chose.
it's, yeah, I mean, thank you for that answer because it was so thought-provoking. Um, Especially like when I'm thinking about memoir and authenticity
Yeah,
and
for
what
sure.
obligations we have to the reader, the obligation to like what constitutes the truth, right, and
Yeah.
subjectivity. So we'll get into that because whew, that is amazing. Thank you. But last question, I think, about the mise en scène of the book. I'm like really um so this is kind of like a Bukowskian LA, right? Like
Oh,
this
very
is
much so. Oh, very
yeah.
much so. Yeah.
You capture it gorgeously. And especially like the kind of the rotating cast of fathers, right? It was hard to find a series regular before Frank. And then you got a
That's right.
you
That's
got a
right.
series
Yeah.
regular. Yeah, who Sweet
A lot
Frank.
of special guest stars in this
Yes.
adaptation for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see them like walking on the
Hang
screen like
around for an episode or two. Yeah, for
starring this
sure.
guy. Yeah, exactly. And like one thinks, right, my God, if only Maria Ulloa could have picked up a pen and put all that world building on the page, I would have read, and I know she did write a book, an attempt to write a book. I
Hmm.
know, but
Hmm.
I'm just saying, but you know what I mean? Like if she had
Yeah,
a
I know what you mean. I
residence
know
and
what you mean.
all the resources, my God, I would read the hell out of that book. But I think also, there's an extent to which as your mom is world building, she's also kind of she's not world building on the page. She's doing it in real life, and she's bringing in you and these dudes as characters, And so I was like, I was thinking, right, of like how you described this LA versus Bukowski and how Bukowski was, I think, more of a transient figure in it than Frank,
Mm,
right? And like
mm.
Bukowski's not staying stuck there, as it were, right? And I'm so curious, and this kind of goes again into the code switching, right? But like, how would you like how do you see characters like this, like these this cast of dads, right? These like really economically depressed,
Yeah.
and in, many cases emotionally, as well, depressed kind of these guys are being crushed by a lot of these different economic and social forces. They come to life in your book in, I think, a very different way than they come to life in, let's say, Bukowski's poetry, right? And how
Hmm.
did you, like knowing this milieu in a way that maybe other writers didn't or couldn't, right? Other writers who've been, again, identity here because Bukowski, white guy, right? He's been vaunted in the ways he's been vaunted.
Hmm.
How is it different for you capturing these characters? And what did you kind of what do you think about, writing that scene, right? Writing that world versus how that world is depicted by
Yeah. So yeah, so I appreciate you, our worlds, right? Like my world and
Mhm.
Bukowski's world definitely overlapped. So if you've seen the movie Barfly, which was adapted from, I believe, a couple of Bukowski's books, I don't know if it was a straight adaptation or if they just assembled a lot of books. The
Okay.
opening shot of that movie is of a bar called the Sunset. The Sunset Bar was a 3 block walk from where I grew up. The Sunset Bar is also where one of the scenes in this memoir takes place, where my mother knew that stepfather number 2 or 3, Paul,
Oh,
my namesake, Paul Skyhorse, was in that bar drinking and sent me into the sunset when I was a child, like 11, 10, 11. Okay, so I wasn't like a, waif, like I wasn't like 5, but I was like 10 or 11. Sent me into the sunset, the opening bar in Bukowski's Barfly, and said, go in and get your dad, tell him to come home. And
yeah.
to the credit of the people there, I have to say, like, I was just politely ushered out. Like, it's not like anything horrible, like I was taken to a
Sure.
back room or something, but like, I was just like, hey, like, you can't, you
Wait,
literally can't be in here. I don't care that your dad's here. Get out. Like, just leave,
right.
right? So again, that sort of overlap. It's like a question of perspective. Like, there's the
Yes.
guy on the bar stool, and that's Bukowski's world.
Yep.
But, who are the string of people behind that person on the bar stool? Well, that was me. That was the kid, or his wife, or, my mom or whatever,
Right.
who's like, hey, you are spending what little money you have here instead of maybe where you should be spending it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. So to me, like that's sort of that overlap. Like I'm definitely enamored with that world. I'm drawn to that world, the world of like, CD dive bars, whatever, but for different reasons. It's
Mm,
more like trying again, like almost like being a detective. It's like retracing the steps of like people who were my father figures. Also going back to the idea of identity. At least 2 of my 5 dads had, aliases that like I'm
sure.
like, like we're familiar with. Like one of my stepdads who also would frequent the bars in the area, the Robert character, every time somebody came knocking on the door, and it was usually the police, like, oh, is Alex here? We're like, who? Alexander Hansen. That's who we're, Alexander Hansen. This guy, Robert, who's an American Indian from Alaska. Alexander Hansen? No, we don't have any Alex Hansens here. Why do you ask? Right. So again, this idea of, you know, identity and which is basically, I think, also is kind of like all over Bukowski land as well. The idea of like sort of like shattered dreams, because there are so many people in Bukowski, so many scenes where like I could have done this and I would have done
Yeah.
that, and like I'm gonna do this, and then
I could
like
have been a contender.
6 drinks,
Yeah.
yeah, then 6 drinks later, it's like closing time, right? So
Yep.
I think that for me, the interesting part of sort of Bukowski land, right, is essentially not only the people who are drawn to it, but the people who basically live their day-to-day life there. Because that's also like that bar, I had to walk by that bar, like, every day going to school, right? And there's another scene in the novel, or in the memoir, excuse me, Freudian slip. There's another scene in the memoir where, I'm walking home with this girl that like, I have feelings for, and, we'd had some sort of argument, and like I heard she was moving away, and like, I was like, I wanted to make some sort of like, I don't know, gesture or have some sort of last positive conversation with her. And again, the way you walk home from school is like everyone kind of walks on a similar path, and then they kind of separate. And again, like, we're kids, we're walking on Sunset Boulevard past all these bars, right? It's not like an abnormal thing. And I'm trying to keep up with her. We're moving in this group, and I see stepdad number three, Paul, standing outside the Sunset. And he's like, "Hey, son, like come over here." And I see her walking away, and she ain't stopping for me. And there's my dad. So I have to walk over. It was the last time I saw her, right?
That's
Outside the Sunset Bar, which of course no longer exists. It literally is now a parking lot. So, I think
oh
again,
man.
that idea of sort of like, identity. I think a lot about how this is also very much like it's a uniquely a Los Angeles story. There's no other place that this story could have taken with such, I think, devastating effect or impact than Los Angeles. And I think that's also part of the reason that like every book I've written is still it's set in California, it's set in LA to a greater or lesser degree, because this is the Los Angeles that I knew. That
Yeah.
even within Bukowski land, there is still a subset of this experience that I felt wasn't chronicled, wasn't detailed. So I'm sorry, that was probably also a long, meandering,
It's fantastic.
roundabout question, thinking
Well,
about
no,
identity
yeah.
and
Well, it answers actually even more than I asked in the best possible way. I mean, because yeah, you are such a writer of plays, which I love, and also going back on the stranger than fiction thing, right? Like sometimes the metaphor is too perfect. And I think
yeah,
that's the case for
yeah,
the Sunset Bar is
yeah.
literally a parking lot. Like
Yeah, it's
it's
literally a
too
parking
ideal.
lot now.
If I brought that into your workshop, in your fiction workshop, what would you say, Brando? Would you be
Oh,
like,
it's on the
ah,
nose. It's a
it's
little
so
on the
on the
nose.
nose. That's
It's
exactly what
on
you'd
the
say.
nose. It's on the
Yeah.
nose.
You'd be like,
And the
go
thing
back,
is,
Frumpkin. Just, rework this.
yeah, because like I was there, like every time I go to LA, I try to like stop by Echo Park. I could, it's like radioactive for me. I could take small doses because then it
Yeah.
just kind of overwhelms me. But like I
Sure.
go back there, it's still a parking lot, and across the street from where the Sunset Park, like right, just directly across,
Mhm.
um, where the old video store used to be, Simon Video. It's now a burger shop that serves vegan In-N-Out burgers. Vegan In-N-Out burgers
Yeah,
in Echo Park.
that's the ultimate
Expensive. They're
insult.
delicious. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
I think it's called like the Habit or something. Like they're a little pricey, very good. But so to me, it's like that sort of that overlap, right? Like how things change, how things transform. The idea that in a place like Los Angeles, a place that in the 80s, if you drove down that part of Sunset, you would lock your doors. And now it's one of the hippest areas in LA
Hey,
and has been for a number of years. Hippest, right? Not poshest, but just hippest.
yeah.
So
That's all those
interesting stuff.
shattered dreams paved over by so many vegan burgers and nut milk.
Vegan burgers, right?
Yeah,
Right.
THC infused matcha lattes. Wow. Okay, so I could really talk about the
Yeah, sorry about
contents of
that. I
this
mean,
book forever.
yeah.
Yeah, but I want to ask some craft questions here because which I could also talk about forever, but I'm going to try my best to narrow it down. Okay, so when you were talking about your memoir class, that
Yeah.
alas, I'm not auditing, you described the like speaker, I was just like, oh my God, I wish I could like listen to your lecture about this
Mm,
because
mm,
you talk about the speaker of the memoir, which of course,
yeah.
right, makes any of us who've taken these classes or taught these classes think of the speaker of the poem, right? And how it is because poetry has so much in common with memoir, at least, like if we're talking about confessional poetry, let's say, right, as
Right.
a genre,
Right.
poetry where you have to, I think, in poetry and nonfiction, at least just certain types of nonfiction really like emphasize this distinction between the self who is writing these things and right the kind of unstated self who is speaking them on the page. And
Hmm.
like I'm so, my God, Brando, I'm just like so deeply interested in how you are encouraging your students to distinguish themselves from the speaker of the
Yeah.
memoir. And
Yeah.
then, so that's question one. And then the little sub question of that is how, when you did that in this memoir, how did that help you gain empathy for your mom, say, or right, for people who had really harmed you, your mom and your grandma? How did that help you stay empathetic and not, because people who've experienced that type of abuse, right, could say this type of person always harms me, right? So like I'm a man,
Yeah.
women always harm me, or like
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a person of color, like white people always different, so like how do you kind of stay expansive through that exercise?
Yeah. So first, it's important, especially in a memoir workshop, right? Total honesty with the page.
Yeah.
And the reason that I emphasize speaker is that the moment you start to judge the actions that you're writing, like you're going to hold back. You're
Mm.
going to like start to self-censor. You're going to start to edit and like, oh man, I did that. Well, I don't know. Like, but also again, there's this agenda at work, right? Where like, basically if you're writing something that's traumatic, it's like, oh, look at this person that's harmed me without acknowledging any sort of like, actions on your part, because there's no such thing as a perfect person. There's no such thing as like a perfect speaker. So I think that what I try to encourage in the class is like, look, when we talk about this in workshop, let's say the writer writes about something that they're not particularly proud of. Let's say they raise their voice at like their grandmother. Or let's say, like just something like, not cool or whatever. They acknowledge that, right? I don't want them to self-censor that because there could be a moment of discovery there. So instead of saying, man, I can't believe the writer in this workshop did this really like just gutless thing, you say the speaker did it. Because even as you're writing these things, you're still self-selecting things. There's still word choice. There's still all these sorts of things. So there's no such thing as a 100% wholly accurate memoir. That's not what memoir is about. Memoir is the depiction of change and transformation in a person. And whatever you want to depict to us that helps us understand your change and transformation, that should be on the page. But people aren't reading memoirs because they're court transcripts. People are reading memoirs because they want to see that progression. They want to see that journey. It's like, oh, you had a broken home. You had five stepdads. You had a mom that almost killed you twice. Your grandmother was physically abusive as well. How are you not dead? How
Yeah.
are you not like, so these are the moments like I pick and choose and illustrate to say like, here's this happened, here's that this happened, here's what I learned, either I learned now or later, etc. So I feel that using the phrase or using the word speaker is really, really important. And also I think in terms of reading memoir, as somebody, I know you enjoy memoir, like reading memoir, that everyone loves like some people love the pieces that are dramatic, right? But the point is to like read it from like a non-judgmental perspective and to say like, okay, like this isn't a book. Somebody obviously figured like it was worth my $28 to like read it. It's like, okay, what am I learning from this? What did this character learn? What journey that they go on? And maybe I wouldn't have necessarily made those decisions, but like I'm reading with an empathetic point of view and saying like, oh, I understand why this person did this thing that was like not acceptable or hurt somebody or whatever because they learn from it and they don't do that anymore, or they come through the other side of it, right? So I think again, speaker neutralizes that sort of like that judgmental process that I think sometimes that can almost always happen in a workshop, right? And because if we know that happens in like if we know that happens in the classroom space, you're not going to get anything worthwhile. You're
Hmm.
not going to get anything usable.
Yeah.
What was the second part of the question?
Oh, you kind of answered it. It was basically how in your own in writing Take This Man, how did you thinking of yourself as discrete selves, i.e. Speaker and Brando, help you maintain or develop more empathy for people who'd really severely harmed you?
So that's the second part. Um, the first draft of this book, I'm not present at all.
Mhm.
And that was a really important lesson. Part of the reason this book took so long to write is because I went through multiple iterations. And the first draft, it literally read like a court transcript. There were no scenes, there was almost no dialogue. And my editor said, what the hell is this? Like we can't, I can't, what do you, I can't do anything with this, right? And I
Yeah.
realized that the only reason that I'd written that draft, was I wanted validation for all the things that had happened, all the hurt that I had suffered at the hands of my mom and my grandmother and my five stepfathers, because there was no shortage of hurt amongst that whole crew.
Yeah.
And she said, a wonderful editor named Millicent Bennett, she said, nobody's going to care about these people if we don't care about you first. So you
Mm.
have to be the lens by which we view all these people. And to me, that was a fundamental misunderstanding. That was literally the first lesson I learned about my memoir. I thought people would be interested in the craziness of all of these people doing all these crazy things. And she's like, no, what we are interested in is you. So you have to be the lens that helps us see how all of these things, how your mom, how your five stepfathers, how your grandmother, all these things impacted you directly, because then we can observe and understand your change and transformation. So that to me was the lesson in terms of like putting this together and realizing, in my first draft, first of all, there needs to be a speaker. It
Yeah.
can't just be this like floating perspective. But that
Right.
secondly, that this person, this speaker, needs to be empathetic to everyone on the page, including myself,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to saying, look at how my mother almost killed me. Look at like how my grandmother did these horrible things. Look at how like these men did these horrible things to my mother and then in our house, right? Unless I could frame all of that with empathy, nothing was going to happen. And to me, it still blows me away that, like, when I went on tour and, I met people who read the book or still got emails or whatever, I still get like the number one piece of feedback I get on this book was like, I really loved your mother. What a wonderful person. And it's always kind of weird because it's like, did you see the part where she tried to kill me like two times? Like, did you get that part where she was abusing drugs and all this other stuff? And then I realized, oh, I did my job correctly.
Yeah.
I allowed you to love my mother in the same way that I love my mother, while still honestly portraying all of her faults, all of her issues, all of the things that she had to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have come to that, nobody would come to that conclusion if I hadn't painted these scenes, if I hadn't written these scenes with complete and total empathy.
Wow. I mean, it's God, it's so true, Brando, because like the person who picks this up in Barnes and Noble isn't like justice for Brando Skyhorse. I have to read this, like, this like testimony
Right,
of horrible abuse. They're
right.
thinking like this is a gripping story that articulates a variety of themes. It is a memoir, but there's a way in which, right, and I think we can talk about this more in a second. There's a way in which people pick up memoirs with the same instinct that they pick up a novel.
Mm-hmm.
And that like and how the writer and their identity factors into the selling of that increasingly is deeply fascinating to me. But I want to just quickly before we get into that more, I want to ask a question about of authenticity. That's a word that
Mm,
it comes
mm.
up a lot, right? It popped in my head. It comes up a lot in kind of popular discourse around identity
Yeah, sure,
and
sure.
one's authentic self, right? And I think there are purveyors of authentic selfhood, who are maybe not as well intended as we would like to believe. But without getting too deep into that part of things, I kind of want to talk about the authenticity of the artistic project, right? The authenticity of the memoir. And so when you're teaching this class, right, about memoir writing, you having written a memoir, Brando, about a lot of people, who were being inauthentic, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You who were
yeah,
made to kind of participate in their duplicity
yeah,
as a
yeah,
child.
yeah.
How do you begin to suss out, right? Like what truth you want to tell and
Mm.
what truth you feel is owed the reader. You can't give them perfect objectivity. You don't want to be the court stenographer, right? But at the same time, right, you don't want to, of course you're not, but no one wants to be James Frey. So where do you draw the line there and how did you figure that out for yourself?
Yeah. So, yeah, James, boy, that's a name that takes me back a few
Me
years, because that was
too.
that was a big discussion back in like the, I guess, early mid 2000s, right? The
Yeah.
idea that like these memoirs had attained massive stratospheric success and were almost entirely fictional.
Yeah.
Fictional in the sense that like, yeah, not like, oh, this guy was in jail for 4 months and he was actually in jail for 3 months. It's like, oh, this guy was in jail for 4 months and he was like in lockup for 8 hours.
Right.
Like that's kind of like to me, like just taking these like big sorts
Yeah.
of sort of leaps, flights of fancy. Um, there is a memoir that was published, I think, a little around the same time. It was called Love and Consequences, and it's out of print now. It was published by Penguin, and it was written by an author who was named Margaret P. Jones. And
Mm.
Margaret P. Jones was a white woman who, in the memoir, her story was that she was raised by an African American family as a member of an LA street gang. And this memoir got rapturous blurbs. It got Michiko Kakutani, who was the head of the New York Times Book Review for many, many years, raved about this and said this was like a searing portrait of like, authenticity, like whatever, right? And
Yeah.
you know where I'm going with this. And then, of course, like about a week or so later, the author's sister said, this woman is not Margaret P. Jones. Her name's Margaret Seltzer. And, she's like a girl who grew up in the Valley and like the San Fernando Valley and went to like a prep school and like, here's all the information that you need and blah, blah, blah. Right. And then, of course, the book was pulled. And, I actually
Course.
have a copy. I bought it like at a library sale because these are the types of questions that I'm interested in asking in my classrooms. Right. And
Yep.
so for me, as somebody who has like read a number of memoirs, Mary Karr's Art of Memoir, she has a whole take on this, right?
Right.
My feeling is that the job of the memoir is to recall things to the best of their abilities.
Yes.
Nobody is going to hold you accountable because like, oh, at the age of 3, your mom said this and you actually said that. There are scenes in my memoir, recreated dialogue, right? From like when I'm very, very young. Do I have like a like note perfect, recall of those conversations? Of course not. However, having grown up with somebody who has borderline personality disorder, they tend to repeat things a lot. So I
Mhm.
would hear the same stories over and over and over again to the point where, like, I basically memorized them. I was like, oh, yeah, if she was angry, I would get this flavor of story. If she was happy, I would get this flavor of story.
Mhm.
And if she was whatever, I would get this flavor of story. So my obligation then was, okay, this is my story as best as I can remember it. And if there are other things that like, feel like nebulous or whatever, well, like I'm just going to keep that off to the side, or maybe I'm just not going to put it into the book because it doesn't feel like it's illustrating the point that I want to make, which again, in order to have a memoir that effectively demonstrates change and transformation, you need to recall those moments. And so for me, the beauty of like having been able to publish a memoir is like somebody paid me to do this. So I'm looking at it more along the lines of like somebody paid me to take a look at my life, look for the moments of change and transformation, and write them and share them with other people.
Mm.
There's no reason to write these fantastical experiences because then I haven't learned anything from the writing of the book. I write, and I think you write as well, to learn things. I write to learn things about things that I don't understand. And again, I wrote this book because I wanted to understand what was going on in my family, what was going on in my mom. And I started this project years after both my mom and grandma had passed away. So they weren't here to tell me. And even if they were, I wouldn't have gotten an honest answer anyway. So the whole point was to learn something about myself. I did not want to put myself in a position of selling out my own creation because that's what I would have done if I made things up. If I had written the story of like, oh, I was taken to a reservation and made an American Indian chief, and like all the story obviously that my mom probably would have wanted me to write, right? That for many reasons is so less interesting of a story. It's so less interesting of a story. And so again, to me, the story about how a young white woman who grew up in the San Fernando Valley decided to create this narrative, this 300-page book
Yeah,
That's
sure.
a more interest on it. That's a more interesting story
Yes.
than like, oh, you grew up on the streets of Compton, and
Yeah.
it's you get what I'm saying?
Oh,
So
I
to
do.
me, it's like I
Yeah.
feel as a writer, I think that readers now, especially I think with everything online and the fact that even back in '07 that deception was exposed almost immediately.
Hmm.
I think that readers are keen enough to like process when they're reading something that they know that the writer is making um, every intent to like learn from what they're writing about and to share that learning with you. I think readers, especially now, I think readers can puzzle that together. They can figure that out.
You know, this reminds me of, I think, what I think of as a fateful conversation that you and I had in Brewburger in
No,
Bloomington, where we notably were not eating vegan burgers.
we
We're
were
not
not.
drinking nut
Yeah,
and milk, right?
right. That's
But
right. That's right.
you
That's right.
said you said we were talking about, because I was talking about a memoir project with you, and you said like we were talking about trauma writing, right? Which I think
Yeah.
is a big part of both of our projects.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
writing your way through it, right? Where it's almost like this like I mean I think graphomania is probably a strong word, but it's almost like this like you are being bombarded with some intense stuff, right? And the only way to make sense of it and move through it is to kind of transmute it into memoir, right? And so, that's what I think of kind of when you're talking about writing to learn, and that transmutation is a function of personal growth and learning. And
Mhm.
to that end, I kind of want to ask a question about research. So like you studied with Jeffrey Wolf,
That's
who,
right. Yeah,
right,
that's right.
as
Duke of
we both,
Deception, wonderful book. Yeah.
exactly. And that was because his dad was a con artist, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't as if he was like sitting down with his his dad had died anyway. He wasn't close to him, but it wasn't as if he was like, "Oh, dad, speak into the recorder. Let me tell you."
Yeah.
Like he was interviewing other people, right, about this guy. And is similarly, with you, like you were like you had to, you say many times you had to do research and fact check the claims that a lot of these adults in your life were making. And so, like I'm sure there are folks who are working on their memoirs or want to write memoirs who are probably watching this. If you could speak to the function of research, right? And the kind of the journalistic function of memoir as well. What is it like to write what really amounts to as or what really amounts to ultra subjective reportage?
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the research and then talk about like what you can do again if like everyone is dead or whatever, right?
Hmm.
So to give you one example, there's an incarcerated person named Paul Skyhorse. And
Hmm.
again, if you read the memoir, it gets a little crazy because there are actually two Paul Skyhorses, but for the
Oh,
sake of simplification, right? There's Paul Skyhorse in Los Angeles who was accused of a very notorious crime. I believe was murdering a cab driver in like the late 70s. And, because my mother was interested in American Indian politics, this Paul Skyhorse, along with Richard Mohawk, became sort of like a cause celeb of like the American Indian movement. And one of the first memories I have is of going to a courtroom. And again, not like being like at a park with like, my grandma, like, feeding the ducks or whatever, going to a courtroom, sitting down and seeing this guy being brought in. And I believe like he had like this, he was behind this like plexiglass shield or whatever. And my mom saying, "That's your dad." Right? And again, well, how the hell am I supposed to know? Okay, that's Paul Skywars. That's my dad. That's who he is, right? And so for
yeah.
years, I had this question of like, okay, I hung around with them. I have some memories of like being in like the community, and just being accepted as like his wife. And again, my mom was very attractive, so it didn't seem like there were a lot of questions that were being asked. I know there were other women who was involved with or whatever, but it was like, was that a story? Did that actually happen? I don't know. So, one of the things I was able to do, he passed away a few years ago, is I wrote to the Bureau of Prisons and I filed a Freedom of Information Act. And it took months, as these things do. And then finally, one day, I just got this like bundle, like it's about maybe 700 pages. And, everything on Paul Skyhorse. And again, like there's a lot of heavy stuff in that file that I obviously was not expecting, like, psych reports, prison transfers, the whole thing, because it's, it's the Freedom of Information Act. It's documents. You can get
Right.
whatever you want, right? So I started going through it. And and I'm not exaggerating here. To trust me, it would be very easy. Why exaggerate about any of this, right? The
Right.
next to last page, like on page 677, because I'm going through this and I was like, there's nothing. What am I looking for? Right? The next to last page, there was a prison sign-up sheet in Los Angeles. And whose name was on it? My mother's name, my mother's exact name, and not the name that she told people, because she told people she was running Deer Skyhorse. Her
Right.
birth name was Maria. Well, her married name was Maria Ulloa. Her actual birth name was Maria Banaga
Mm,
because her stepfather was Filipino. I don't know her biological father's last name, but Maria Banaga, that's what was on her documents and everything. There it was, like a needle in the haystack. Maria Banaga visiting Paul Skyhorse. So again, she had told the truth. I had like she had visited him, and again, that's one document. Who knows how many other times maybe she did or didn't visit it, but like she had conflated it into
sure.
something like much larger, more grandiose. Now, that bit of research, those 700 pages, that maybe is 2 lines in the memoir, 2 lines. But again, I needed that connection. I needed that authenticity for just those 2 lines. It would
Yeah.
have been easy as the writer to say, like, oh, I've read all these documents. That's not in the memoir because it's not interesting. I
Right.
just needed those 2 lines.
Right.
So that's to me the effectiveness of research. Even if you get those 2 lines, man, like to me, it was like that's the connection I needed. If you don't have like somebody who was like incarcerated or like documents or whatever, right? Can you talk to people who knew these people? So when
Yeah.
I talk about my mother killing me, trying to kill me for a second time, my high school sweetheart was there. Again, the one who had dumped me and then,
Right.
alas, took me back or we got back together. I don't know what the hell she was thinking. So this was around Christmas and my mom and I gotten into an argument. I think it was over the board game Monopoly, as many good arguments begin over the board game of Monopoly because it's a cruel and terrible game that nobody should play.
And I'm sorry, just
And
to interject. I'm convinced that game was invented to torture boomers and Gen Xers because
I
everyone was like,
agree.
"Oh God, I was ruined by
they're
Monopoly. My
they're
family
breaking
deserves
out
to
the
live."
monopoly. Yeah, let's get out of here, right? And
Yeah.
so, to make a long story short, she went to the kitchen, she grabbed a knife and was walking toward me. And my high school sweetheart, and I think I gave her a pseudonym in the memoir, which felt appropriate to do, but she still read the pages. Like I still talked with her about it. She was like, we let's go. Let's just go right now. Let's leave. Let's get out of this house. Let's walk out of here right now. Right. And so later, when I got in touch with her, because I had her email address and I was like, hey, I'm working on this thing. Would you please read? And she's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And so I asked her, I was like, so, does this jive with what you remember? She's like, well, you toned it down a little. I was like, really? She's like, yeah. She's like, I remember it being a little more intense than this. She's like, you kind of cut a few things out, but she's like, yeah, this is what happened. And she's like, and this is
Wow.
this, she's like, but she's like, even if like you would like amplify, she's like, this is your story. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you remember it in a more intense way, who am I to say like, oh, it happened a different way? But she's like, yeah, this is what happened. And for me, like it was so important to try to get that right because my mother was such a serial fabulist. It was so essential for me to make sure I want to get this as accurately as I can. So you can do document research, you can talk to people, but if you have none of those things, again, trust your memory, trust your instincts of like this situation, right? One of the things that I encourage my students to do is this exercise called the memory index, and I assign it to all of my students. And it's a really wonderful way to kind of get your memories, like kind of like to figure out what you actually can remember. This exercise is adapted from a poet whose name is, I believe, Rebecca Lindenberg. So I want to give credit where credit's appropriate. She published a book called Love and Index. And so what I ask the students to do is to pick a person, place, or thing. You have to use a noun and to attach a noun to every letter of the alphabet and then free write 100 words about each noun. So 26 letters, 2,600 words. And I have them turn this in as their final assignment. And the reason I do that is that if I were to ask you, Raphael, to tell me about your father, F is for father, I'm not going to get anything useful because you've got all of these sorts of barriers, all these sorts of things that I have to get through, right? But if I were to say like, oh, write L, like L is for lemons. Now, when I think about lemons, I think about the fact that like my family had a lemon tree. And I think about the fact that the lemon tree, the colors of the lemon were the same color as our house was painted. And I think about how my grandmother hated the house we lived in, hated the color of the house, said it looked like a goddamn lemon. And that was the house that my grandfather had bought for her. Now, you
Yeah.
now know so much more about kind of like my family, the
Mm.
seeds for potential friction down the road, not because you gave me an exercise that said, tell me about your grandmother, but because I started thinking about limits. So to me, like if you do that exercise and you speak to whomever is willing to speak to you or can speak to you,
Mhm.
and whatever additional research you need to do, I think that's basically all you need to do to write your own book, to write your own memoir.
Woo. Man, I'm just gonna let that be a mic drop because that was poof, that was elegant. Thank you so
It's a
much.
good exercise.
It's a good
Trust me,
exercise.
it's a good exercise. And every student I've worked with who has done this exercise has told me, like, wow, like I'm remembering things I had no
No, I
idea I'd even thought of, right? Because you're using the nouns as the way in, you're using these objects, and you're not using these big words like mom,
yeah.
dad. You know what I mean? Like there's just so monolithic, and like you have your all your kind of personal emotions attached to it. So
So now this is my very last question, and this is actually going to, well, it's my penultimate question. I have one t small one after this, but
sure,
this is
sure.
going to take us from now the kind of like a weird word to use maybe about a creative writing workshop, but the kind of like Edenic, almost like creative, untouched, generative space of the writing
Yeah,
workshop, where it's like, hell yeah, like I'm just exploring what I want to explore. And that it's a beautiful place to be. You and I have both taken them and led them, and it's
yeah,
wonderful
sure.
in many ways. Now let's go from there to we're at the bookstore, we're on the bookshelf, right? And I'm browsing the memoir section. How do I decide what to pick up, right? And so I think that with memoir, Brando, it's this wild thing where I would like you have to almost have a story. If I'm not, Taylor Swift, right, or Juliette Lewis, or like whomever, if I'm not writing a celebrity memoir, um, I have to have a story that's almost stranger than fiction, right? And there's some stories so strange that the person may not be a writer already, but may be enjoying to write them. Um, I think in your case and my case too, right? We both have some pretty strange stories, and we also happen to be writers. But then, there's this trend. I mean, I think trend is maybe even a little too generous of a word. There's almost this kind of like these dueling hegemonies in publishing, right? Where it's like
Mm, mm,
from one side, like publishing has always been like hyper masculine and hyper white and hyper moneyed, yada, 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 right? But then on the other side, in order to kind of correct for that, right, which is of course an admirable impulse, but there's almost a hegemonic overcorrection, right? Where it's like, okay, it's your identity only, right? Are you not white, or like, are you not a
mm.
man, or are you not straight, or are you whatever? Okay, we're leading with that. We're leading with that. And so you really see that kind of, I mean, I think one word for it would be tokenization. You really do see that kind of like, um, hey, like you're the person who can speak to this specific experience and its attendant traumas. And we're really going to distill this down to your identity, right? And I think this is something that, like, having written the memoir you've written, I mean, you are really, really qualified to speak on. I'm kind of really curious to get your thoughts, Brandon, on my gosh, how identity plays in not just the writing of a memoir or this memoir, right? But also kind of like in the kind of the release of it out into the world, right? Like
Mm,
how does
mhm.
that function? Like how did that work for you, and how was your reaction to it?
So a couple of things. Like I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, to any of your friends, as you called them at the beginning of this conversation, not everything that we write needs to be published.
Hmm.
Not every project that we pursue needs to be put out in the world, right? Not every memoir needs to be published. You can write something that's just for you or write for a
Mhm.
close circle of friends. And because like there's so many like self-publishing avenues that you can explore now that are so diffuse from when like we started publishing books. Like you can do like small little print runs or whatever. People for it doesn't have to be like a big thing anymore, which I think is good and also important to keep in mind, right? Because again, the bigger the publisher, the larger their expectations are in terms of what they expect a book to do. So I think it's important to just acknowledge that, what are the reasons that you are you know, writing this book for. Like if it's for fame or celebrity or money, those, as we both know, are terrible reasons with which to
Oh,
write books
oh,
because none of those things ever happen. So if you can write them, if you're writing something for the sake of your own, to learn something. I
mhm,
think I can't think of a nobler reason to like write memoir. Like you want to learn something about yourself, you want to learn something about your family. Those are all really awesome, incredible reasons with which to produce work, and something that you should definitely keep in mind.
mhm.
Um, I think the challenge happens is when there's an expectation upon the creator that like, publishing should do this, publishing should do that. Publishing is a business, right? And I think I just saw an article in the New York Times. It was about maybe, I want to say a month ago or something, about this guy who had written a memoir. And it was, I think, he was doing readings at Chinese restaurants.
Mhm,
And I can't remember the name of the book, but again, the New York Times loves stories like this, right? Oh, he's doing readings in Chinese restaurants. And like the book is, I think, set like the table of contents, the structure is like a Chinese restaurant menu.
mhm,
And he talks about uh, he in his interview, I guess in the article, it's talked about how he sent the manuscript out to like 90 agents and got like 90 rejections.
mhm,
And I think he then like wrote back and said, because I think the original conceit of the memoir was like my life in a Chinese restaurant. This is what it's like in a Chinese restaurant. So he got a bunch of rejections. And then he was like, well, it's also my coming out story. And then
mhm,
all of a sudden, he had multiple
mhm,
offers of
mhm.
representation, multiple offers to be published, etc. Right? So I think again, even now, that was like I said, that was about a month ago in the New York Times. I think it's very telling, right? That's sort of like that intersection between like expression and commerce. Whereas
Right.
like if he really just wanted to write the Chinese restaurant memoir and self-publish it and go out on his own self-funded tour and do all that stuff, he could have done it, but then getting the note saying, oh, this part that you also mentioned, if you make this a larger part of your story, now we have a mechanism, we have basically a system in place that knows how to market that knows how to sell that, right? So I think again, like I don't know what the takeaway is from all of this. I think that for me personally, uh, I started this from a very simple place, which was like wanting to understand what was the deal with like my family, and then hoping that somebody would be interested in it and would want to publish it. And you never know how these things go. This is a little publishing inside baseball, which probably shouldn't even like share, but I'll share it anyway. This was part of a two-book deal, and the publisher really, really wanted this memoir. Like they really wanted it. And I was like, well, I've also got this book, The Madonnas of Echo Park. They're like, yeah, all right, fine. We'll do that first. But like, we really want the memoir. And which book has outsold the other? Well, my novel, The Madonnas of Echo Park, has outsold the memoir, oh, by about 20 to 1.
Mhm.
So as
Yeah.
far as mic drops, you're listening to this video, and at the end of it, like, well, the person who just gave me all this really interesting advice sold like 80 copies of this thing. So
Well,
so how do I know, right? Who
but
who am I
see,
to say, right?
this is where I come in, and maybe this is me being hard-headed here because I too am right there with you, like
Never know,
in
right?
the business of publishing. No, I know, but
Never
like I
know.
think that's the thing, though, right? Is like it's what feels so what has always felt kind of so hard to me about the kind of the big leagues, as it were, is the fact that like it always has like it does boil down to sales for many people, and I understand why that is
Sure.
kind of a
Yeah, of
practical
course. Of
determination.
course, I get it. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, there it is a business, but I think I know many writers for whom. it boils down to sales like for them as well, right? And it's hard for it not to, and it has for me in the past, like, and it's, it's a feeling that still kind of creeps up. And I was thinking, right, like, I was thinking about going back to your mom, this phrase popped into my head. There was no Maria Ulloa didn't have a mechanism to sell Mexican woman in Echo Park. Like she didn't have a mechanism, like, in the same way that PRH knows how to sell, okay, you're like gay, you work at a Chinese restaurant. She didn't know how to market herself, as it were. And in
That's
this the
right.
conversation again, I think about the American dream, right? Well, when she pivoted to, well, I'm running Dear Skyhorse, I know how to sell that easy. And I think that like it's just endlessly fascinating for me. I mean, as someone who hasn't had a breakout bestseller, right? It's fascinating for me because I'm like, well, like obviously, I'm supposed to want, right? Because I want to keep publishing books, XYZ. But then I think at the same time too, right? It's hard to predict where the story will land or what connections will make or
Yeah,
what thing
for
foments
sure.
the next. And so, I think to kind of bring it full circle, right? It's like we are sold in many ways the American dream a bill of goods, right? Which is that, you can remake yourself and you can become XYZ successful person if you join the bottom of this pyramid and just pay to your upline. And I think that like the real American dream, right, is this kind of, I mean, it doesn't have to like be tied to America, right? But if we're undoing the American dream, we could talk about more what you're talking about, Brando, right? Where it's like, yeah, you can become someone else. Yeah, you can like become a success through learning about yourself, through transmuting your pain. Like, yeah, maybe it is about becoming someone different psychically, like emotionally,
Yeah.
you're not as captured by your pain. And so, to boil it down to numbers is one way to look at it. But I think that to the transmutation piece is important too.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think what you've given is just basically like kind of like an almost like an eloquent summation for like, why writers write, why artists create. That if you're doing it because there is an expectation of some sort of specific kind of outcome, you're going to have a really bad time.
Yes.
But if you do this because you feel that you want to learn something about yourself, learn something about the world, and there are literally no expectations attached to it, right? I expect to have a New York Times bestseller. I expect to be published by like one of the big three, one, how many big publishers are left? I don't know.
All of
Like,
them.
I want to be published in this way and have this kind of success. Then, yeah, then obviously you're doing it for all the wrong reasons. But if you're doing it because you want to find something that is meaningful about the process and your relationship to the process. And, this is the thing that I could keep reminding my students all the time is like go in with like, no expectations to success. You can have expectations for a result, but like thinking about expectations of outcome, it's always a bad time. And I think every writer, every artist falls prey to that at
Oh
some
yeah.
time or another, right? They have something I didn't. They got this
Oh,
cool thing that like I wanted instead. But if you can just focus on like, well, what did you get in to do this for, right? Like I've been writing essentially since I was 16.
hmm.
And I still think that to me, it's like that buzz and that joy that I get, when I sit down, it's just me and the work. Like if I could live in that buzz and kind of put everything else aside, that to me, like that's how I know. That's the reality check. That's like, oh, I need to keep doing that. Even if everything else gets like, book deals or whatever. If I can just do that and focus on that, that's a great place to be.
Man, what a perfect segue into my very final little question, which is
Yeah.
what's giving you that buzz lately? Whether it's working on something or listening or reading to something or any, classes, projects, like what's a teaser you could leave us with
Yeah,
for someone
yeah.
else's?
So I've got two books in mind. One I had in mind for a while. I think maybe I talked about it with you at Brewburger. I can't remember, but there's another one that pushed its way to the front of the queue,
Mm.
and it's set in an alternate. 1985. Same
Ooh.
year as Back to the Future. So I'm just like obsessed with the 80s for whatever reason. And it's set in this alternate timeline that envisions that the neighborhood that was destroyed to make way for Dodger Stadium. For those who might not know, there was a neighborhood there. It was predominantly Mexican American. It's called Chavez Ravine. It was where Mexican Americans were basically steered to in Los Angeles, where they could own homes and live, etc. And so the city of Los Angeles decided uh, we're going to claim eminent domain and we're going to do something with it. And a number of proposals were pitched. They were going to build like a new neighborhood. And then ultimately they decided we're going to build Dodger Stadium there. So they came in, bulldozers, they took everybody out. And so I was like, well, wouldn't it be interesting if I could set a novel in that neighborhood, but set it in 1985?
Mm.
So I've hired a researcher who is going to get or photograph all these records that they had made at the time because again they had sketched out. I think it was going to be called like Elysian City Heights or whatever it's going to be, and it was going to
Mm.
have like like they're going to like Americanize it, right? They're going to anglicize it. Like it was
Oh.
going to be like here are like the tract homes, and here are the apartments, and here's where like each apartment's going to get like a new oven and like just
Mm.
really like kind of like do it up. So I want to set a novel in that neighborhood, but like set in the 80s. So imagine 25 years of wear and tear. And it focuses on a coming of age story about a young boy, not dissimilar from me, who thinks that his new stepfather is the Night Stalker.
Mm.
But it turns out he's mistaken. He's not the Night Stalker. He is, in fact, a shapeshifter. He's
Mm.
a monster called basically El Nahual, like John Carpenter's The Thing. So in
Mm.
actuality, his stepfather is the Thing. And if you remember that movie at all, it's like he absorbed, like the Thing absorbs animals,
Yeah, yeah,
people, doesn't
yeah.
really matter, like everybody, right?
Right.
The novel's called Monster California. And again, I
Mm.
think that if we talk about the themes that we've talked about this whole conversation, identity, ethnicity,
Yeah.
who is their authentic version of themselves? Well, this is literally made manifest. Like this is literally an exploration of that. Plus, it also, riffs off of one of my favorite films, The Thing,
Hmm.
and sets it in 1985, which for me it's just like that's I was 12 years old, right? It's for me it's like it's always evergreen and ever sunny when you're 12 years old. So putting the two together to me seems really interesting in a neighborhood that of course literally never existed because it never got the chance to exist. So I want to put those two
Wow.
together. I'm really excited about it. We'll see how it goes. I'm always excited at the start of the project. I'm always excited when I'm like, you know what I mean?
Same.
Like, you're not going to see me in
Yeah.
like a year or two and like, I don't want to look at this thing. It's done. Get it out of here. So
Right.
at least right now, like, I'm looking forward to it. And again, like, I got that other idea on the back burner, but it kind of pushed its way up to the top of the queue. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. We'll see how it goes.
Man, that is awesome. What a fantastic premise. And I admire the comprehensiveness of the answer because usually I try to like kind of soft pedal because some folks are like, I will not say anything.
Yeah,
Let's
no, I
I
get
totally
that.
get
I
that.
get that.
I
Yeah.
totally get that. But I'm
I,
like you. I'm like, here's the whole, do you
Yeah,
know
I
me?
will.
Here's
I
this. Here's
feel everyone has their own different process, but like I feel
Mhm.
like if like I've battle tested it enough, for me, it's also
Yeah.
being selfish because I feel like every time I pitch the book, I'm always listening to like what did I change in that pitch? Because sometimes the idea is a little stronger. So like it's like evolved. Obviously, this version has evolved a little bit from when I started telling people about it. So it's a really efficient way to do some market research as well. So that's the
Well,
way I
my
look.
God,
That's the way I look. That's the way I
on that
look at it,
ending
right?
note, let's leave on the market research note.
Sounds
Brando, thank you
good.
for doing market research with us
Yeah.
today.
Hey, that sounds great. Really
This was
lovely to,
phenomenal.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say this was really awesome. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate I hope this Substack and this channel continues to grow because it
Thank
really is
you.
nice to be able to have this like long form conversation. You and I, we do, these kinds of things all the time. And it's always, and there's no disrespect to other things we've done, but it's always very scripted.
Yes.
It's always on the beat, it's on the point, and like
True.
here's your 5 minute answer or your 3 minute answer. And so it's nice just to have like this space where, we can, instead of
Yeah.
just like, you know, da 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 da, we could actually have a conversation. So that's great. So
Absolutely. And well, yeah, I appreciate that. And this is, yeah, I hope to keep having these long until I get to the point where I'm like, oh my God, I'm I can't have I'm so like I'm too verbose, so it kind of suits it. But when I get to the point where I'm like, oh, my endless energy well means that I have to have shorter conversations,
I hear you.
then
I hear
yes.
you.
But I'm gonna stop the recording. But thank you, and you and I will talk after. But thank you so much,
Okay.
and appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Raphael.